Thank you so much. It's an honour to be here. We thought that we should start together. We're going to take a couple of moments just to each share a bit, but it's an honour to have Larissa here. Maybe you can, yeah. Did you want to say anything before? Awesome. Fantastic. Beautiful. I was so humbled to be able to hear the sessions earlier today and to be able to hear from such influential people and to be able to think about what this moment means, to imagine a legacy. And just as we did this morning, I'd really like to honour the traditional custodians of this land and the elders past, present and future. I do this because in Romans 13 it says to give honour where honour is due. And today I want to start with a phrase that really shouldn't feel foreign to any Sydney-sider in the room. Are there any of us? Yeah. The phrase is G Wallawa Nalawala. So you can say it with me. G Wallawa Nalawala. This is a welcome phrase, and it means stop here and rest a while in the Darug language. And I hope that we can indeed stop here and rest a while to imagine the legacy that this Australian generation could pass on to the next. But who is the Darug nation, you might ask? This language is a phrase from the nation that is in Sydney that stretches from the North Shore over to the Hills District and through Parramatta. You know, I learned a lot of things growing up in Australia. I learned about the cockatoos that screech through the big blue sky over my house. I learned about the waterfalls. If I made it down a certain path soon after the rains, through the sandstone cliffs there were these beautiful waterfalls that I could sit and watch sitting amongst the flannel flowers. And yet, I'd never heard of the Darug people. And I'd never heard any of the languages that was spoken on the land that was underneath my house in which I grew up. The history of Australian people shouldn't be kept like a dirty secret. Some of you will have heard a little bit about my story. Many of you, your faces look new. And I grew up in Sydney. I started singing with Hillsong when I was, I think, 14. Have been in the church serving for most of my life. And then one day, I had an audacious conversation with God while sitting on a tree that looks like this one here. The trees that line many of our Sydney inner city streets. And that conversation led to a 5-year journey and me doing my PhD at Fuller Theological Seminary. I was advised to get a topic that wouldn't bore me no matter how long I had to study it, which probably tells you a little bit about the faith of the people that I was talking to. And I found that listening to God speak through the land on which I was born and the people of that land could never bore me. But now that I've finished this project, I do ask myself, why? Why was I so interested in this when so many other Australians don't seem very interested at all? And perhaps it's because if I could describe my family's connection to land, it would be with a simple phrase, Eden lost. This is my grandmother. And when it comes to legacy, the first thing that I think of is my only living grandparent, Betty Sheila Miller. We call Betty the matriarch, and she really is kind of like the queen. For example, she doesn't smile in photographs. It's a part of the appeal. After World War II, at the age of 18, Betty met a kind and generous man called Eric Miller, who was also kind of eccentric. And Eric was a scientist at the CSIRO, and they met Jesus in their 60s. Before that, though, Eric liked to hit the Bondi pub at 5 p.m. with a large carpet snake to ensure that he could get his order of drinks in before the closing round. And Grandma is the keeper of the tales of Eric. She is a detective at heart, and her hero is Sherlock Holmes. Half of my family have gone into the arts and half into the sciences, and Betty can keep pace with both sides. She keeps a calendar of all of our movements, and every flight that we take out of the country and every flight that we take back in is inside Grandma's diary. But Grandma's life didn't start with the kind of hope and joy that she carries around now. For much of her life, actually, she believed that she was left as a baby on the church doorstep. And Betty Sheila Miller was in and out of foster care, and like many children in the foster care system, was abused relentlessly. You know, it wasn't until my cousins organised a DNA kit that we found out our ancestry. And this was the day, I have a title in my head, the day I learned my ancestry through an SBS article. It turns out that both Betty and Eric's heritage is Welsh. Don't worry, they're not very closely related. And Betty also has a hint of Belgian in there too, which, you know, we're quite proud of, and 2% Southeast Asian that nobody in the family really knew what to do with. I don't think I'm alone in having this kind of a story. Many Australians have lost connection to their heritage. But when you actually find your missing heritage, it makes you think more about who you really are. And you ask yourself, is this 8% why I really have a deep affinity to waffles? Many Australians can't point to the land in which they came or even where they find a connection. But land is very significant in the Bible. Genealogies are written out in fine detail and are very important and communicate something to the people for whom they're written. And knowing that God was born as a little Jewish baby on the edges of a Roman Empire should say something to us about how God chooses to reveal truth. In my PhD research, I wanted to know whether Jesus was similarly turning up on the edges of Australian cities. Could he be found where society least expected him? And I found that indeed he was. My research took me to 3 Australian cities, and I interviewed 88 people who attended churches with Aboriginal senior pastors. And I found that God was doing amazing things in our nation. So often we're looking to other continents to provide the stories of what God is doing. But I found that, and this is within the Australian Bureau of Statistics, 73% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders self-identify as Christian. Many of them struggle with the church and the missions, but self-identify as Christians. And 98% of Torres Strait Islanders self-identify as Christians. You know, I learned that the different Australian nations cross our map, like the European continent. That the diversity is a part of the beauty of our nation. I learned that Aboriginal peoples from the mainland share culture, and that Torres Strait Islanders are honoured as a distinct group, and that the phrase Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander is really the terminology that most of the world is using to explain our Indigenous peoples. I learned many things, but you know, most of my PhD I can describe in this way, as an unlearning. When I began my program, I believed that the most intelligent person in the room spoke the most and the loudest. I learned that leadership doesn't always present in skinny jeans and holding a latte or a bulletproof. That's not to say, though, that Aboriginal leaders don't wear skinny jeans and hold lattes. But I had to unlearn the things that I'd been taught, and many of those images I'd been taught I'd gotten through the media. I had ideas about who Aboriginal people were and who they weren't. I had ideas about what Aboriginal people contributed to our nation or did not contribute. And all of these things had to be unlearned as I sat down and began to talk. I was taught by the Australian media to look for the Aboriginal disadvantage. But when I turned up in these churches, they spoke clearly and loudly of an Aboriginal advantage that Aboriginal pastors bring to their church, a bicultural Australian sensibility. And I suspect that many in our generation will have to unlearn the images that we've been passed in order to relearn and tell a story, a new story about Australia. There are two other things that I unlearned that are particularly important to understanding, or that I found were really important to understanding what God is doing in Australia. First, I had to unlearn all my Christian foyer conversations. You know, the one where you're trying to get past the people in the foyer to get to your seat before the pre-roll starts. Those conversations where you say, "Hi, it's really nice to see you," and you actually just mean that, like, nice to see you. But you don't necessarily really want to connect. There are so many times when we turn to each other in church and we go, when we're invited to pass the peace or to meet the person next to us, and, you know, we say something that we think we're supposed to say, and then we turn back to watch the almighty screen. And I had to learn how to yarn. Yarning is the Aboriginal word for conversation. And I've had Aboriginal leaders tell me that there's nothing distinctive or really unusual about yarning, and that might be true, but I've never had a pastor organise 18 hours of conversation for me before. But when I contacted Pastor Will and Pastor Sandra Dumas, who minister in Tweed, and I said I'd really like to come and learn more, because I believe there are untold stories that God is doing in our nation, they organised for me 18 hours of conversation, one-on-one, sitting down and talking, yarning. What I learnt in those yarns I have been given a gift that I really believe I will hold for the rest of my life. One of the things that I was taught about myself and my community is that we've been taught to sell the gospel, but we don't often know how to tell the gospel. We have often learned to preach tweet. Little invitations to come to the building at 7 p.m. where we hope that they understand that they will meet with Jesus. We, at times, are guilty of watering down life community into a two-dimensional cartoon. I learned that the stories that we tell about ourselves are the ones that we end up believing about ourselves. And the stories I was telling about the Australian nation weren't old enough. They weren't vivid enough. They weren't interesting enough. And they weren't always completely true. They were the stories that would help me survive, to make it back to Eden in the next life. But these Australian Christians welcomed me into land that I've been living on for all these years. And this is the second thing that I had to unlearn. I had to be welcomed into land in order for it to become home. There are many Christians, and I've talked to so many of them, who struggle with welcome to country. And there are so many reasons for that, but it saddens me that there are Christians who will pull their children from schools in order to not have their children exposed to welcome to country. But for me, a girl who's no memory of anything other than a little house in Epping, for me, to have welcome to country means so much more. It means that we can live out the kingdom of God in Australia, not in an imaginary Europe or an imaginary America, but here and now. That we can be embraced into land and that we can include land in our telling of the gospel story. The biblical scholar N.T. Wright comments upon how often humans fall short of their potential. He says this: made for spirituality, we wallow in introspection. Made for joy, we settle for pleasure. Made for justice, we clamor for vengeance. Made for relationship, we insist upon our own way. Made for beauty, we are often satisfied with sentiment. But new creation has already begun. The sun has begun to rise. Christians are called to leave behind in the tomb of Jesus Christ all that belongs to the brokenness and incompleteness of the present world. Quite simply, what it is to be Christian is to follow Jesus Christ into a new world, God's new world, which he has thrown open before us. The earth and all the people within it are a part of God's new world, and it is good. When I was invited to address this conference, I said yes, because I knew that in this room are the storytellers of our nation. Within this room are the people who have the power to create new images of our Australian nation. And so I ask you, as I ask myself, what is the story that God is writing in Australia? And I think maybe that we have to start somewhere very unusual for our culture, for dominant culture, and that is to listen. We have to listen to hear this story. We have to listen past the loudest voice in the room and listen for the God sounds. Listen for the stories that are on the edges and on the margins. I know you're all people that do that anyway. But together, I believe that we can do that. And this is why I asked Larissa Minicon to join us. She's been proven in the secret place of worship and in prayer and has a deep understanding of Jesus. The Bible suggests that we're all living epistles, that we are created and written in order to glorify God, so that all who read us can see. And Larissa is writing a story of pure grace and courage. You know, many times when we bring up this issue to Australian audiences, and particularly the church, they ask, but what about me? Where do I, a white Australian, fit if we start to amplify the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? You know, and I've thought about it a bit, and I think this: if I am known only for amplifying Australian voices that glorify God and that are found around us, then I will know on my deathbed that I told the truth about our nation. And that is a legacy that I would be entirely proud to leave. Please welcome Larissa.
Thank you, my sister. Once upon a time, in an archipelago across the southern seas, there was an island known for its 2 volcanoes. This island was famous for its black sands as well as its black magic. On the southern eastern tip of the island, there was a village, and within that village lived a family of 3 brothers, the youngest being 12 years old. Now, there were stories carried in the winds of big canoes and white men stealing black men, women, and children. The chief of the village told his people to be careful and not to set eyes on these white ghosts who steal bodies. One day, the 3 brothers were preparing to hunt for food. The 2 oldest brothers had decided that they will leave the youngest in the village whilst they hunt in the dense forest. Being the youngest, he wanted so much to join his brothers and contribute to the village the way they did. So when the older brothers left, he gathered his fishing nets and gear and set off towards the beach. He knew of a perfect spot and wanted to show off his skill to his brothers with a big catch of seafood. The sailor could see the schooner in the distant horizon of the sea. They anchored off the reef a few kilometres from the shore. They needed supplies for the journey back, and if lucky, catch a few blacks as a bonus to sell back at the markets on the Queensland coast. Lucky the captain and the government official are looking for good sales of blacks, and the 3 sailors on the shore were looking forward to their cut of the pie. Along the black shoreline, the lone sailor noticed a young man, a strong, tall and muscular build, with black skin the same colour as the volcanic sands. As he quietly walked closer to the young black man, he noticed his catch of seafood. The boy had caught enough fish to feed his family and the village, which meant there was enough food to feed the captain and government officials' greed and maybe bribe them for more money. The sailor will be favoured among all other crew members for feeding the crew and the captain for the 5-day voyage back to the Queensland shore. The young boy had such joy in his heart for catching so much seafood. He looked forward to going home, back to the village, to show off his bounty to his older brothers, but more importantly, sharing the food together with his family. It was his last memory before darkness fell over his mind. The pain was sudden and sharp. He felt like a dream had suddenly grabbed him and floated through the night skies. He awoke to the sounds of waves knocking against the canoe. Heaviness bound his ankles and wrist. His head sore and wet from a blow of a sharp rock. Slowly, his eyes adjusted to the darkness to see other dark eyes staring at him. An older man helped him up and sat him up and leaned against the mast pole that shot up through the deck and into the skies that held the sails. He leaned back his head and closed his eyes, trying to hold back the well of tears as he came to realise the sudden dilemma he had been forced into. He remembered the stories. He knew he could not go back. He closed his eyes, trying to remember each face he loved: Mama, Papa, brother, sister, uncle, auntie, his friends, his village, repeating it over and over again until darkness took him under the cover of sleep. This is not a fairy tale. This is actually my great-great-grandfather, who was blackbirded from Vanuatu and helped the sugar industry that happened all up the coast of Queensland. And in that story, he met my grandmother, and my grandmother was Aboriginal, and they married, and they had 15 kids, and so my country, my grandmother's country, is Kabi Kabi, which is a neighbour to this country, and so we're the Sunshine Coast, and so we're brighter. No. But I guess what I wanted to say is that, fairy tales really do have morals to the story. Between the once upon a time and the happily ever after, fairy tales are usually conveying social and political issues. And so I thought about this, when we're talking about the Australian church, and a lot of the stories that my father and my uncles and my aunties have said is that we have a lot of pot plant Christianity here in Australia. For one, we have the Anglican from England, we have Lutherans from Germany, we have Hillsong from New Zealand. These are the things that have never grown in our soil. What does the Australian church look like? Because we haven't started this conversation yet. And I say this, so in Hebrews 12, 1-12, we are that Jesus is the author and finisher of our faith. So we know that our faith will finish, but we are still writing the story of our Christianity. And that for an Australian church to really take hold, we need to be involved in the story. We need to have that conversation. I think, what our pastors, my Aboriginal pastors, like Uncle Willie Doomis, and what they bring, and brings flavour to what is already Australian. I know that there are big political climates that we talk about, but that comes with the story. We have to accept that being Aboriginal is also being political. I was born into it. My great-grandmother was under the Aboriginal Protection Act. My father grew up in that, and it wasn't until the 1980s that we could come out of that. We have been part of policies. We have lived because of policies. We have been segregated, but now we are here to build a generation where we can have that yarn. But you have to have the courage and the power to be exactly like my sister Tanya, is to look and to educate yourself on what the true story is. Otherwise, you miss out. You miss out. I don't, but you do. And so this is the invitation from me, is how will you continue this story? How will you influence and build an Australian church where I'm included, where I feel included, where my uncles are included? That's the future for the Australian church that I see and that I want to write. And I hope that we all be a part of this journey together. Thank you.